Hello, everyone. This is the 197th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I interview English author and professor of history, Dr. Alan McDougall, as we discuss East German football from 1974 to dissolution in 1990. Dr. McDougall is an English professor of history at the University of Guelph at Ontario in Canada. His books include The People's Game, Football, State and Society in East Germany, Contested Fields, A Global History of Modern Football, Youth Politics in East Germany, The Free German Youth Movement, 1946 to 1968, and Dreams and Songs to Sing, A People's History of Liverpool Football Club from Shankly to Klopp. And this is going to be released in late August, I believe, right?
Yeah, 7th of August in the UK and then 28th of August around the world. So, yeah, exciting.
And Dr. McDougall previously appeared on a podcast a few years back discussing East Germany during the 1974 World Cup. Well, Alan, welcome back.
Thanks, Shahan. It's nice to be back.
Let's pick up where we left off last time. We come to the autumn of 1974. Can you paint a picture of East Germany in terms of football and sociologically in this post 1974 World Cup era?
As your listeners will know, if they remember our previous podcast talk about the 74 World Cup, in the autumn of 74, East Germany's football team is coming off its biggest moment, of course, a strong performance at the 1974 World Cup on enemy territory in West Germany, which, of course, famously included a 1-0 victory over the capitalist rivals from West Germany. So the team returned home to a pretty good reception, not necessarily from the head of East German sport, Manfred Ewald. He focused on Olympic sports and wasn't super impressed that East Germany only ended up finishing sixth in 1974. But broadly speaking, I think in 1974, after that World Cup performance, there's some cautious optimism among East German football officials and fans and players that a strong group of players will be able to continue their good form, will qualify for further major tournaments, and kind of change East Germany's football reputation. So I think after the World Cup, there is a cautious sense of optimism in East Germany. And that is reflected, I think, in sort of the wider social, political situation in East Germany. Erich Honecker had replaced Walter Ulbricht as party leader, Communist Party leader, 3 years earlier. As we'll go on to discuss, no doubt, Honecker turns out to be just like so many other communist dinosaurs. But at the time in the early 70s, there was a sense that East Germany was to some degree liberalizing culturally, was allowing more films, music, blue jeans to be accessed by the youth population. Living standards were probably around their peak in East Germany in the early to mid 70s. So again, there's a sort of sense of cautious optimism around society. Now, we caveat that by saying in both football and more wider society, one of the things Honecker is doing is growing the secret police, the Stasi, very rapidly. So there's lots of dark shadows around the corners, as we will discuss. But from the outside, at least, I'd say yes, cautious sense of optimism in autumn 74.
Did the 1974 World Cup, did that in any way lead to a bounce in football in terms of interest? Were there any tangible improvements as a result?
That's a tricky question to answer. I think it did, at least in the short term, fire public imagination around the team. The East German national team doesn't have a very kind historical reputation, as we talked about in the last podcast, and as I talk about in the People's Game. It's usually looked on pretty negatively. But I think that 1974 victory over West Germany, the fact that East Germany at this point had some pretty talented players across the pitch, from Jürgen Klopp in goal to people like Joachim Streich up front. I think that meant there was probably more public interest in the team in the mid 70s than, as we'll discuss, there will be in the 1980s, which is a pretty gloomy decade. So yeah, I would say public interest, yes. I think the problem for East German football in the mid 70s was the problem that East German football had always faced in the communist system. And that was that many of the top sports leaders, notably Manfred Ewald, the head of East German sport, they wanted to focus on Olympic sports. They wanted to focus on climbing the medal table, which East Germany was doing very well against the Soviet Union and the US. in the Winter and Summer Olympics from the late 60s. And so for a lot of those functionaries, people like Ewald, football was frankly a bit of a pain. It cost a lot of money. You didn't get that many medals in return for it. It was very competitive, so it was actually hard to even get to the World Cup, let alone do well in it. But at the same time, the authorities couldn't just ignore football because it was so popular. And the 1974 team had given, I think, East German football a boost in public image. Whether they could carry that on was the big question, of course.
So, in its first objective, the 1976 Euros, East Germany, still under Jörg Buchner, they were
Mm.
eliminated in a group with Belgium and France. So,
Mhm.
was that seen as a regression?
I don't think that was necessarily seen as a regression. I think, as we'll come on to talk to, there's a couple more qualification campaigns that are more painful. The European Championships, what we now know as the Euros, I mean, we should perhaps remind particularly younger listeners, it was a much smaller competition then. They'd expanded it from the very early
And only
days.
one team qualified, by the way.
Exactly. So qualification was very tough. And again, this is something to remember, I think, and we'll talk about this in some of the various campaigns in the 70s and 80s. There was usually only one place available for European Championship qualification, sometimes two for the World Cup, and you were often up against some pretty tough teams. So I think the 76 one is not a big one in terms of the annals of East German failures to qualify for major tournaments. I think, as we'll come on to talk about, some of the other ones are bigger. And of course, you could say, I suppose, that failure to qualify for the 76 Euros was softened somewhat by the fact that East Germany won the 1976 Olympics in Montreal. Now, that didn't necessarily replicate winning the Euros or the World Cup, obviously, because teams in the Olympics were at this time amateur, which the Soviet bloc teams got around because their players were nominally amateur, but obviously.
We should remind that this is the era of so-called amateurism.
Yeah, amateurism, exactly. So all of the players in East Germany, for example, if they played for Dynamo, they were technically police officers. If they played for Lokomotiva Leipzig, they were, in theory, railway workers. Didn't actually mean they were doing much policing or railway work, but it meant nominally they were amateur footballers, so they could participate in the Olympics, which means, of course, that throughout the history of the Cold War, teams from behind the Iron Curtain, communist teams, dominate the Olympics. And so, I mean, that was a partial compensation maybe for not reaching the final stages of the Euros in 76. But I think behind closed doors, at least, certainly fans understood. And I think officials from the Football Association understood that actually this was low-hanging fruit. This was not the same as competing against the top teams in the world in the Euros or the World Cup. But maybe the 76 Olympic gold in Montreal helped to just kind of ease the pain of not making the Euros that year.
It was the last moment of glory in any
Pretty
case.
much. That was as good as it. That sort of 74 to 76 period was really the sort of a very
Yeah.
short golden
And it
age of
could
East
be
German
seen as a
football.
continuation of the 1974 adventure in a way.
Yeah, and quite a lot of the same players as we talked about in the 74 pod. I mean, that was a team that had been built over a relatively long period, with some quite experienced international players. And one of the problems I think East Germany faces as it gets into the later 70s and early 80s is some of those great players begin to step back. Some talented players emerge, but there's maybe not the same team drive and sort of integration that there was in 74. Yeah.
And we should mention the 76 gold medal was against strong Polish team that they defeated 3-1.
Yeah, and that is worth mentioning again as a bit of a reminder to listeners that East Germany they weren't quite the losers that they're sometimes portrayed as. This is a Poland team that will go on to do extremely well at the next two World Cups, podium finishes or qualifying for semi-finals in those World Cups, qualify again in 1986. And like East Germany, they sent a lot of strong players to the 76 Olympics. So yeah, a not insignificant achievement, but behind closed doors, I think East German football officials knew that this didn't paper over other cracks that were beginning to grow, actually.
This gold medal did not have, again, the bounce required, and East Germany and Jörg Buchner, they failed to qualify to the 1978 World Cup. They were narrowly edged out by the Austria of the likes of Hans Krankel, among others.
Mhm.
So, with that, was the glow of the 1974 generation officially over?
Yeah, I think by this point, two successive failures to qualify for tournaments would have set alarm bells ringing in the headquarters of the DFV, the East German FA in East Berlin. After the 74 World Cup, I think the internal reports on the team and its future goals would have seen it as a sort of a bare minimum requirement that they would now build on this and at least qualify for major tournaments. Because bear in mind, before 1974, East Germany had never previously qualified for either a World Cup or a Euros, which, given the fact that it produced some pretty talented players over the decades, was a real underachievement. I think that's probably fair to say. So, failure to qualify for two successive major tournaments, even against pretty strong opposition and with tough qualifying criteria, I think does begin to set alarm bells ringing. And it's a bit of confirmation bias, I think, for the people in the East German Sports Association, the DTSB, like Ewald, who wanted to focus money and time on other sports, Olympic sports, where East Germany, of course, was doing superbly for legitimate and illegitimate reasons, shall we say. And so what you get in the background, I would say, emerging in the late 70s and early 80s is increasing disharmony in East German sport between people trying to kind of get to the bottom of the problems with football and trying to figure out what's ailing the national team. How do we get better? Do we concentrate more players in one club? Do we try and interact more with the world outside the socialist bloc? Do we need to change our training programs, et cetera, et cetera? And then you had the sports generalists who frankly didn't really care that much about East German football, kind of just saw it as another sport to fit into the East German sports program, but not the most important sport. So I think some of those tensions, which were maybe put on the back burner in 74, they never went away, but they start to reemerge as the East German team goes back to underachieving in the sort of mid to late 1970s. Yeah.
And that also was reflected in the fact that Jörg Buchner remained in charge despite
Yeah,
non-qualifications.
yeah, absolutely. Bushner had a lot of credit in the bank. He'd been the national team coach for a long time. He'd presided over by far the team's most successful period, of course, from 74 really to 76, but particularly 1974. And as we often see in football, I mean, even with the greatest coaches, maybe there's a sense of them staying too long in the job. And as we'll perhaps go on to talk about, I mean, Buchner lasts quite a lot longer and perhaps longer than he should have in the job. Perhaps a younger generation of players don't listen to him as much as the generation that's a bit closer in age to him. So it's possibly the case that the sort of East German Football Association held on to Buchner for a bit too long. But as we'll see, once he leaves, they really struggle to replace him with anyone of the same quality of coaching. So yeah, maybe there's a sense that some of the team and certainly the coach are getting a bit long in the tooth. I mean, there's plenty of bad luck stories we can get onto and narrow misses. I mean, maybe we'll talk about one of those in a moment in 1979. But yeah, I do think by 1978, certainly that feel-good factor around 1974 is beginning to dissipate. And interestingly, I would say, again, because football often runs in parallel to society, sometimes shapes it, sometimes reflects it. I think the honeymoon period of the Erich Honecker era is well and truly over by the late 1970s. You get the emergence of different youth subcultures, including punks and football hooligans and some signs of youth protest in East Germany. The economic bump of the early 70s isn't kept up, and East Germany begins to borrow quite heavily from Western banks and Western countries. So it starts to build up the kind of debt that will lead eventually to its collapse in the late 80s. There's food shortages, supply shortages. You have to wait years for an apartment. You have to wait years for a plastic-sided Trabant car. So I think for both football and East Germany more widely, that kind of honeymoon era is definitely over by 78.
And in this latter half of the decade, you still have players such as Jürgen Kroy, Hans-Jürgen Dorner, Reinhard Hafner, Jürgen Pomeranke, Hans-Jürgen Riediger, Joachim Strach that you mentioned,
Hmm.
and Jürgen Sparwasser, of course, the goal scorer against West
Hmm.
Germany. But like you said, they're showing signs of age at this point, and as we come into the decade, they're no longer, most of them at least, are no longer a factor.
Yeah, exactly. And I think East Germany had a very good youth talent development system in football and produced a lot of good young players throughout its history. But maybe there's a slightly fallow period between the 70s and the later 80s. In the later 80s, as we'll perhaps go on to talk about, there's a great crop of young East German players who emerge from Thomas Doll through to Matthias Sammer. But of course, they emerge at a time when the
Right.
political situation collapses. And so East Germany does not get the benefits of that generation. Maybe in between that kind of
Well, the
golden
players
generation.
certainly did, but that's
No,
a
the
different
players
story.
did. Yeah, that's right. The players did very well out of it, as we'll go on to talk about, at least financially, and in some cases in terms of their careers. But of course, there was no longer an East Germany at that point to benefit from that youth talent development. But maybe, between that golden generation of the mid 70s and the crop of the mid to late 80s, maybe there's a bit of a fallow period. I also think another factor we want to think about as we head into the 80s here, Shahan, is the rise of Dynamo Berlin, Berlin FC Dynamo, BFC, as the dominant force in East German domestic football. BFC win the league championship for 10 straight seasons from 79 through to 88. And I mention this because I think it has quite a big knock-on effect on the national team. Dynamo Berlin are a very unpopular team. They're associated with the Stasi. Many supporters and no doubt other players and coaches think that they're buying their way to success, bribing referees, taking all the best young players. And I think BFC's dominance sort of creates a sort of a rather toxic atmosphere in East German football in the 1980s. There are stories about BFC players playing for East Germany in the 80s being booed in national team games in Dresden and Leipzig, the two big other football
And
cities in
also,
East
their
Germany.
dominance did not reflect in European club competitions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So Dynamo Berlin struggled in Europe in UEFA competitions. I think they made the quarterfinals of the European Cup maybe once in all of those years of winning the league. And I think also, if you look historically, like think back to the great Hungarian side of the early 50s, which was built around the army team of Honved. That was a successful example of what we often see in football today and over history, which is look at the great Spanish teams of the early parts of this century, which are concentrated to some degree on Barcelona. Teams concentrated on one club often have quite a lot of success in international football. The opposite was true for Dynamo Berlin in the 80s. They were the dominant team in the league. But that dominance, as you rightly say, was never translated to European club competition and also never turned into a coherent, successful national football team. BFC had a lot of players who got to the national team, but as I mentioned, some of them got booed in Dresden and Leipzig. It never felt like you could have that club nucleus built around this hated club that you've seen over history in other situations in world football.
Well, Buchner was still in charge for the 1980 Euro qualifiers. And again, in a difficult group containing two of the best teams in Europe, the Dutch and Poland. Unsurprisingly, East Germany did not go through. It seems like it's a pattern now that since 1974, they're still, let's say, an okay team, but they just don't have that little bit of extra to be able to qualify.
Yeah. I mean, this is a particularly important one, I think. If we're thinking about kind of the decline of the national team after 74, the key game in this group was the very last one, 21st November 1979. I think there's about 90,000 in Leipzig's central stadium for the decisive qualifier against the Netherlands. Netherlands team that's been to two successive World Cup finals. So a very good team, obviously. Perhaps not quite at its peak, but still a very good team. And East Germany, with a win at home here, will qualify for the 1980 Euros. It's a very rainy night. The stadium is full. In fact, it's really interesting. You were talking earlier about kind of public support for the national team. Well, it was definitely here on this night. It's nearly 90,000 in this vast communist bowl of a stadium in Leipzig, now home to RB Leipzig with a different looking stadium, of course. And East Germany going to a 2-0 lead. There's a penalty from Streich and an early goal from Schnufaser, I think. And so at this point, the East German television footage cuts to the bench and you see Georg Buchner in this kind of ridiculous looking hat that makes him look like something from The Life Aquatic, Bill Murray in The Life Aquatic, celebrating. And you can tell all the players and the coaches on the bench are thinking, okay, finally, we're actually going to get over the line here. 2-0 up. The win will qualify us for the Euros. Happy days. Then, of course, it's East German football. So we know what happens next. They concede a goal towards the break, so it's 2-1 at half time, and then the Netherlands come back in the second half to win the game 3-2 and eliminate East Germany yet again from qualification. Yet again, they lose out by about a point. They usually miss out by a point or two. But this, I would say, psychologically was one of the biggest disappointments because it was in East Germany's hands, which will happen again in 1990. We'll go on and talk about perhaps 1989 and 1990. And they were 2-0 up at home with a raucous atmosphere, everything going their way, difficult conditions to kind of come back and win a game, but they still found a way to blow it. So I think psychologically, and particularly as that was pretty much the last game of the 70s, symbolically as well, this was a really disappointing loss. Maybe of all the losses in this period, perhaps the most painful one.
For the 1982 World Cup qualifiers, with Buchner still in charge, they're in a three-team
Yeah.
group with Poland again and Malta. Poland goes through and they defeat East Germany at Leipzig. At this point, this is the Poland of Lato,
Hmm.
Boniek, and all that. And East Germany is eliminated, and that's the end of the road for Jörg Buchner.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think this one, as you say, partly because it's just this weird three-team qualification group, which is a funny reminder, as I say, particularly for younger listeners who've grown up with these huge, giant groups in UEFA and other qualifying competitions for the Euros or any competition these days, that there were less teams in Europe back in the days of the Cold War. And so you had this weird three-team group. One of the teams, of course, was a non-starter, so it was between East Germany and Poland. I think you could say over the history of East German football, the national team was quite often unlucky in its draws. I think that's probably fair to say. They run into teams that are in a particularly good moment. And that obviously, as you mentioned, was true of Poland sort of in the late 70s and early 80s. I mean, they were clearly at this point a superior team to East Germany. I think, as we've talked about a little before, Buchner had kind of, I don't run out of energy, but kind of, it was the end of the road, I think, even going into this competition in terms of kind of just what he could pull out of a group of players anymore. Couple of defeats to Poland, and that was all she wrote. So Buchner was sacked finally in 1982, famously or allegedly heard about the news on West German television, which of course East Germans technically shouldn't be watching. And yeah, we embark upon, well, what's meant to be a new era for East German football, but ends up being more of the same, I guess.
And the new man in charge is Dr. Rudolf Kraus. He's in charge for the 1984 Euro qualifiers.
Hmm.
They're in a difficult group again with Belgium and Scotland, who had participated in the 1982 World Cup, and Switzerland.
Yeah.
It's a group with no minnows in it, let's just say.
It's a tough group, like quite a lot of evenly matched teams, I think, and that kind of reflects if you look at the results from the group. I think a lot of those teams beat each other, but this is obviously again going back to what I was saying about Poland. You're bumping into a strong era of Belgian football, obviously in the mid '80s, culminating in their appearance in the 1986 World Cup semi-finals, where of course Maradona brings them to a halt, but also a relative golden era in Scottish football with talents like Kenny Dalglish and just a very solid team, I think, that is in the middle of qualifying for successive World Cups. And to go back to the appointment of Krause, I mean, so that's kind of in some ways quite a strange appointment that reflects on that division I talked about earlier between the sort of, if you like, the sports technocrats at the DTSB, the Sports Federation, whose kind of idea of football is let's just treat it like we treat our other performance sports and we'll give it similar programs and so on and so forth. And the more football specific line that was being put forward, obviously by the East German Football Association. So I think Krause definitely sort of represented maybe that first group, the kind of sports technocrats who maybe didn't have as much feel for and experience of football as someone like Buchner, as maybe like some of the other leading East German coaches who we'll perhaps go on to talk about, like Stanger or Geier. So it was a bit of a strange appointment, and it obviously led to the same results as we've been seeing, which is a failure to qualify
Well, he
for
did
the
not last
84
long, and in
Exactly.
fact, midway through the qualification process, he would be replaced by Bert Stanger. And there was some improvement in the late run-up, but by
Yep.
then the damage had already been done. And again, East Germany did not qualify, but perhaps there was some optimism because of the late form, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. And I think there's a sense sort of in the public among football supporters that they've corrected a wrong in appointing Stanger, who was an experienced coach, had coached a lot in East German club football. And as you say, results got a little bit better. But a lot of the debates in East German football, I think, about the national team kind of are going around in circles by this point. If you look at kind of, I don't know, anything from police reports, the reports and discussions in the National Football Weekly, Die Neue Fußballwoche, the new Football Weekly. If you look at letters to the Football Association from fans, everyone's got theories and ideas about what's ailing the national team. Should they be taken from a smaller number of clubs? Is the BFC factor actually a damaging influence on the national team? Do they need more ideological training? I mean, of course, that was always the Communist Party's argument, as if that had any impact whatsoever. Do we need more contacts with the Western world? I mean, East Germany is starting to play more friendly matches outside the socialist bloc, I think, by the 70s and 80s. It does take on, I think in 1984, for example, it plays England. It starts to play a little bit more regularly against some of the top teams in the world who are all from South America and Western Europe, broadly speaking. But there's definitely a lot of sort of going round and round in circles. Whoever the manager is or the coach is, whoever the personnel in the starting 11 is, the narrative seems to be the same. a failure, but usually not a catastrophic failure, usually missing out by a point or two. And there's always reasons because there are actually always good teams in the groups that East Germany are losing to. And it is, we should say again, it's harder to qualify for tournaments in the 80s than it is probably today. You don't have qualification playoffs as much. It's just a smaller number of teams and a smaller number of places in the
Yeah,
tournament.
and we'll get to it, but truthfully, they only really implode in the very last campaign.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I mean, I think I would say the second half against the Netherlands in 79 is a sort of a one game implosion. I think that would be fair to say. And I think that's the one that kind of hurts the most in this period. Otherwise, though, I mean, if you look throughout this period, the East German national team, just like East German club teams, they're not brilliant, but they're perfectly capable of beating and drawing with some of
Right.
the world's best teams. They do that against, the likes of England and Brazil and Italy, the Netherlands, the Soviet
France,
Union,
yeah.
yeah, France, exactly. They have some decent results over this period. So again, I think there's two things to think about here as to why this isn't good enough in East Germany. Number one, of course, East Germany is a brilliant Olympic nation. It's up at the top of the medal table with the Soviet Union and the United States in the various Olympic games that it competes in this period. Of course, not LA in 1984, but whenever it competes, it's at the top of the medal table. So that's one thing. And then the second thing, of course, for context as to why East German football supporters are so unhappy is that, of course, after 1974 and beating West Germany, we know that West Germany gone to win that World Cup. They've already just won the 1972 Euros. They're going to go on in this period to be still one of the dominant forces in international football, qualifying for every tournament, of course, reaching the final stages of every tournament, including, of course, the 1982 and 1986 World Cup finals before winning it again in 1990. So I think that's the other thing here is a lot of East German football supporters, particularly, they're looking west for comparisons and they're seeing a bit of a juggernaut, which qualifies for international tournaments without kind of breaking sweat. And meanwhile, East Germany is struggling to get over the finishing line. So I think those two contextual points are really important. The Olympic strength, West Germany's strength, kind of make East German football look perhaps a bit worse than it actually was.
And these 1984 Euros are the last campaign of Joachim Streich. Incidentally, Eric Batty in World Soccer, he named him as his player of the year in 1983.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's amazing, which, it speaks to Strike's longevity, right? And the fact that he was an extremely consistent goal scorer. He'd had this very illustrious career, both club level and internationally. And yeah, that's another sort of the old guard who kind of fades into the background in this period. And
Yeah, he was the last remaining link, I think,
yeah,
to 1974.
yeah, exactly. And so I do think, I talked a little bit about maybe that sort of slightly fallow period in terms of sort of players coming through in maybe the early 80s. And so a lot of these great figures from the 70s, like Strike, the last one of them, they're maybe not replaced or not replaced immediately. And by the time they are replaced, as we'll talk about, East Germany's falling apart.
For the 1986 World Cup qualifiers, Bernd Stanger is still in charge, and East Germany are in a group with France, Bulgaria,
Mhm.
Yugoslavia, and Luxembourg. A tough group,
Mhm.
with France having just won the 1984 Euros. And after a slow start, again, East Germany actually did well in the
Mhm.
tail end of the qualifiers, but again failed to qualify. And again, they're just thereabouts, but they just are not good enough to qualify and not
Yeah.
improving, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're seeing a pretty familiar narrative here, Shahan, that again, tough group. I mean, France, as you say, defending European champions at this point. They'll go on to kind of lose narrowly in the World Cup in 1986. Yugoslavia, always a tough and talented team. I mean, maybe again, another team from the Eastern Bloc that to some degree flatters to deceive and maybe should do a bit better given the talent at its disposal. And actually, the Bulgarian team at this point is also at a peak moment, I would say, around sort of the mid 1980s. So tough group, one or two good results within it. The teams are fairly evenly matched, but again, just on the outside looking in. Again, I think they finished just outside qualification by a point or two, as do Yugoslavia. So they're not the only sort of East European team who failed to get through here. But I would say by this point, there's a real sense of stasis in East German football. And we should also point out, sort of 1985, 1986. is I would say the peak period of public unhappiness about Dynamo Berlin's dominance. I mean, if you look at these famous petitions that citizens of East Germany sent to the authorities about everything, lack of coffee supplies, where's my car or apartment, why don't we have better training facilities for gymnastics or rowing, etc., etc. One of the biggest topics of conversation nationally at this point was the dominance of Dynamo Berlin or BFC, how they had the referees in the pocket, how they were ruining football. And I do think this kind of toxic atmosphere in domestic German football really has an impact on the national team. As I say, BFC players are booed in certain venues when they play for the national team. There's just a sort of a very dark cloud over East German
Yeah,
football.
Dynamo Berlin, the Stasi team, as I guess they
Yeah.
will be known as, they won every consecutive title from 1979 to 1988 that you
Yeah.
mentioned earlier. At this time, for many people, these successive titles was a case alibi for political corruption and
Mhm.
favoritism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it has its impact in a lot of different ways. I mean, I think it's worth saying, and I talk about this a bit in the People's Game. I feel, and if I interviewed some of the coaches who were around in this period, including maybe gone to talk about one of the last co-coaches of the national team, Heinz Werner. And I also talked to a few officials from the former East German FA, the DFB, and they all talked interestingly in this period about a couple of things. One was that East German football was kind of stewing in its own juices, which is to say, was kind of very inward looking. The league was quite small. The international reach was quite limited because it was difficult for East Germans to travel abroad. And when they did, they went with a retinue of Stasi officers. If an East German club played in Western Europe, there was a whole Stasi crew that went with them. So that was, I think, inhibiting. And there was a sort of, I think, a bit of a psychological inferiority complex in East German football, particularly compared to teams from Western Europe, particularly perhaps compared to West Germany. The sense that when it came to the crunch against these bigger Western nations, East Germany was just going to come up short. And I think so all of that is playing into the kind of despair of the mid 80s on top of this whole crisis around Dynamo Berlin and their corrupt ways, which definitely has a knock-on effect on the national team.
Yeah, and in this latter half of the 80s, we have the emergence of players that you mentioned earlier, like
Mm.
Matthias Sammer, Thomas Doll, Andreas Thom, Ulf
Mhm.
Kirsten, just to name a few. But they're still a few years away from being the finished article. But of course, the unified German team would benefit
Mhm.
from their progress in the coming years.
Yeah. Yeah, perhaps not as much as Franz Beckenbauer famously sort of predicted, after Germany won the 1990 World Cup, will basically be unstoppable now. If you add all the young, talented East German players to an already strong West German team, we're going to win everything, basically, was what he said. Didn't quite work out that way, but yes, the best East German players would go on in the 90s, really from Sammer through to a younger graduate of the East German system, Michael Ballack, to really contribute strongly to the unified German team's success in the 90s and early noughties. But yeah, I think, as you say, a lot of those players emerging, particularly Sammer, still a bit young and raw in the late 80s. And by the time they come to maturity, it's, as we've been discussing, another country that's going to benefit from it, not the German Democratic Republic or East Germany.
And in the 80s, perhaps the main successes were Karl Zeiss Jena and
Mhm.
Lokomotiv Leipzig. Both of them reached the final of the Cup Winners' Cup in 1981 and 1987. And that would be really the only bright spots in terms of European performances for East
Yeah,
Germany.
Yeah, pretty much. And of course, I mean, we don't have the Cup Winners' Cup anymore, but it was always considered to be, and I think it's fair to say, was the weakest of the three UEFA competitions during the late Cold War. It was where, of course, East German club football had had its greatest success also in 1974 when FC Magdeburg beat AC Milan to win the 74 Cup Winners' Cup. And so, yeah, Jena and Lokomotiva have some success in getting to the final of those competitions in 81 and 87, but run up against, pretty decent teams in the final. And as we often see, always the bridesmaid, never the bride. East Germany in these two finals just misses out again. But they're rare bright spots, I'd say. As we talked about earlier, Dynamo Berlin tended to struggle in the European Cup, today's Champions League, which was the elite competition. East German clubs generally, I'd say, punch below their weight in the UEFA Cup, which was a very strong competition in this period. And there were some famous catastrophic defeats, including in Dynamo Dresden's kind of throwing away a huge lead against the
Oh, Rapid
relative,
Vienna. Yeah, I remember that.
yeah,
1995.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The one against Werder Bremen. The
yeah.
That was Dynamo Berlin who imploded
Dynamo
into
Berlin
it.
late on,
Yeah.
yeah, that was I think in '88, yeah.
88. Yeah.
So both the big teams. I mean, Dynamo Dresden and Dynamo Berlin, probably the two biggest teams in East Germany at this point because Magdeburg are in decline. They're the big rivals, but both of them, particularly Dynamo Berlin, are struggling in European competition. So yeah, I think those two runs to the Cup Winners' Cup final bring a little solace. But again, it's kind of like winning the '76 Olympic gold. Like it's not really fooling anyone behind the scenes and increasingly publicly. There's a lot of public dissatisfaction with just the general state of East German football, whether it's BFC's dominance, the national team being inept. There's a lot of unhappiness, I think, about East German football in this period. And again, to go back to a theme I've been hammering, that reflects, I think, growing dissatisfaction with East Germany more generally. Living standards are declining. The gap between East and West is getting bigger. Erich Honecker is proving to be increasingly an obstinate dictator. East German economy is increasingly in hock to Western banks and Western nations. So we're kind of heading towards, as we'll see, a kind of a political and economic crisis that's going to burst open in the late 80s.
The last somewhat satisfactory performance of East
Mm.
Germany and Bert Stange were the 1988 Euro qualifiers, where they finished strongly second in a group with the Soviet Union of Valery Lobanovsky
Yep.
and ahead of France. Was this the last great stand of East Germany in a way?
Yeah, I mean, it's the last good stand, I would say. Maybe not great. I was probably giving them a little too much credit, but yeah, again, it's probably worth saying, I mean, that is a good Soviet team. Obviously, it gets to the final of the Euros and only loses out against a superb Dutch team in the final, experienced coach in Lobanovsky. France, I would say, slightly, well, more than slightly on the downside after the brilliance of 1984. That brilliant generation of players is beginning to fade from view, and France is going to go into a relatively long period of decline, I think, until the sort of later 90s, I would say. Again, I mean, it's tough qualification and not many teams. I think this is one of the last two Euros where only 8 teams qualify, if I remember correctly,
Right, right.
before they expand the tournament later in the 90s. So it's tough qualification again. Most teams are going home from Euro qualification before 1988 in disappointment. So again, I think we have to bear that in mind. And of course, East Germany was never kind of one of the top seeds. So, it would almost always be up against at least one very strong football nation. This time it's the Soviet Union, and East Germany will get a tiny bit of revenge in its final kind of qualification campaign for the 1990 World Cup. But I don't think this was again one of the kind of the most crushing disappointments, like compared to probably qualification for the 1980 Euros or what we'll go on to talk about, qualification for the 1990 World Cup. They're the two that stand out to me as the biggest blows and the biggest kind of, if you like, chokes. Maybe that's too harsh a word. This one, I think you can kind of file it under same old, really, because the pattern is very similar as we've been talking about.
We have to discuss the many player defections in this era. I mean,
Hmm.
so many to discuss. You have Jürgen Pahl and Norbert Nachweit in
Mm.
1976. You have the manager Jörg Berger in
Hmm.
1979. There's the tragic episode of Lutz Eigendorf. You have the Dynamo Dresden trio of Gerd Weber, Matthias Müller, and Peter Kote in 1981. There's the Dynamo Berlin duo of Falco Götz and
Hmm.
Dirk Schlegel in 1983, and even Jürgen Sparwasser in
Hmm.
1988. And
Yeah.
even just before the Berlin Wall fell in July 1989, you have Axel Cruz also
Hmm.
defecting.
Yeah.
So I imagine these defections are further evidence that a collapse was coming in every way and not just in footballing terms.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the number of defections in football over the years, relative to the amount of footballers who stay behind, is worth saying, is quite small. But the point is that whenever any international or top flight club footballer leaves East Germany for the West, it is huge news. It's a major political blow to the communist regime in East Berlin. It's a victory for capitalism and capitalist football, if you like, because most of those players end up going to the Bundesliga to play in West Germany. So, yeah, I think they're psychological blows, but they're also, if you think about the case of someone like Lutz Eigendorf, you mentioned his defection and then his tragic death in what some people would see as quite a suspicious car crash, 1983. A player like Eigendorf, he was known in the 70s as the Beckenbauer of the East. Now, he may not have become the equivalent figure to Franz Beckenbauer in the West German national team, but this was seen as a very talented player, someone who the national team could maybe have been built around in that transitional period from the mid 70s to the kind of later 80s, maybe. So not just psychologically and in terms of the propaganda Cold War, but just actual in terms of playing talent, these were big blows. And a lot of the players obviously defected when they were doing international games. A lot of the players you mentioned there defected when they were on international duty, whether it's for the national team or whether it was for one of the club teams. And so, again, that adds to that atmosphere, I think, of just kind of sort of maybe paranoia around East German football. The coaches and the officials maybe not trusting the players in terms of, well, will they even stay? Will they actually defect? And the players in turn not trusting a system which would send Stasi officers with them when they went abroad. So there was no sense reading players' memories of this period or talking to the odd person who was involved in East German football in this period. There's no sense of freedom really in terms of kind of being free to, when you go to a West German city, to just travel, to look around. There was always a Stasi retainer looking over your shoulder. So I think this is hard to prove, I think, but it has an interesting knock-on effect on East German, the actual football. There's lots of, I think, slightly cliched theories about kind of Eastern European football teams being kind of robotic and lacking in flair and individuality. I mean, if you look at the Hungary team of the 50s or the Yugoslavia team of the late 80s and early 90s, that's not necessarily the case, obviously. But I think maybe there's an argument to say that East German football, which had this sort of psychological inferiority complex with West Germany, which was undermined from within by the Dynamo Berlin crisis, was undermined from without by defections and Stasi surveillance. Maybe there's an argument to be said that the players, the lack of freedom they felt off the pitch, reflected in a lack of freedom in their play on the pitch. And maybe that contributed a bit to all of these qualification near misses that we've been talking about.
We're nearing the end. The 1990 World Cup qualifiers started with Bernd Stanger still in charge, and they were simply disastrous in a
Hmm.
group with the Soviet Union, Austria, Turkey, and Iceland.
Yeah.
And Manfred Zapf and Eduard Geyer were appointed in the year 1989, but even they couldn't stop the rot. And this was the worst of East Germany, despite the emergence of players like Sammer, Dahl, Kirsten, and Tom that we have mentioned.
Hmm.
Previously, they would have been maybe just thereabouts, but again, failed to qualify. But this time, they were just atrocious.
Yeah, they were. I mean, I suppose the sort of two games that stand out here are the I think home and away defeats to Turkey, which bear in mind, again, Turkey now in the 21st century, has established a pretty decent reputation in club and international football. Obviously, did well in a couple of World Cups and Euros, but in the 80s, Turkey was a bit of a joke team, shall we say, internationally, was at the level of a kind of Luxembourg, was improving, but that wouldn't be showing at this point. So to lose two home and away to Turkey was pretty bad. I mean, the interesting bit of the story here is, of course, that despite the fact the campaign wasn't particularly good, it wasn't perhaps as strong as some of the previous qualification groups that the East Germans have been up against. So they go into the last game against Austria away in Vienna with a chance to qualify for the World Cup. I think so long as they defeat the Austrians, they could still have a chance to get to the World Cup. The trouble is, of course, this game happens. I
Like a
think it takes,
week
yeah.
after, right? I think the
Yeah, I think
Berlin
it's the
Wall.
15th of November. So 6 days before, of course, 15th November 1989, 6 days before the Berlin Wall had fallen, the East German communist regime is collapsing. The pathway to the West has opened up for footballers as for everybody else. So again, think about East German. The story of the national team is one long hard luck story. If we leave out 1974 and maybe a couple of Olympics, then this is kind of, just in terms of bad timing, the worst bit of timing of them all, really. And so by the time this crucial game comes against Austria in Vienna, with qualification like in 1979 in East Germany's hands, they just need to win against a decent team with some good players, but not, you're not up against peak era France from 84 or 1978 Netherlands here. But when this game finally happens, nobody is thinking about what's happening politically. The Berlin Wall is, which stopped footballers and everyone else from going west, is gone. So yeah, psychologically, it's a very difficult time to play this game.
The fall of the Berlin Wall would have ramifications not just on the football, but
Mm.
obviously in geopolitics, etc. And you have other Eastern Bloc nations would follow suit. Now, The fall of the Berlin Wall, I guess, collapsed at the right time for some of the players we mentioned earlier who could now join a unified German team. This is happening in the era of Glasnost, this late
Hmm.
80s era. Did that have any impact on East Germany politically, or were they kind of separate from what was happening with the then Soviet Union?
hmm Yeah, it's interesting here. I mean, so, East Germany had famously, for many decades, been one of the Soviet Union's most loyal allies. But then Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power in 1985 in the Soviet Union, promotes these ideas of glasnost and perestroika, greater economic and cultural, to some degree, political freedoms. And suddenly, East Germany feels estranged from the Soviet big brother. Gorbachev is pressing very quickly for reform. The Honecker regime in East Germany is very old school. It doesn't want to relax its control in terms of the dictatorship. It doesn't want to allow its citizens to travel. Interestingly, in sport, a number of communist bloc countries are beginning to allow older players, footballers, ice hockey players, to move to the West in the 1980s. The Soviet Union began to do it in the early 80s. You begin to see other Eastern Bloc players make the move finally across to Western European teams. Yugoslavia had been doing this for a bit longer as well. East Germany, though, resolutely refused to allow its athletes and footballers to go and play in the Bundesliga or any other Western league. So East Germany's attitude, I think, here politically and in terms of kind of sport was quite insular. And that worked in the Olympics because East Germany was an Olympic superpower. But in football, where you needed these international contacts, it was a huge drawback. And there's a famous meeting of East German footballers with kind of East German FA officials in the late 80s. And I talk about it a bit in the chapter in the People's Game on the national team. And at this meeting, the players say a couple of things. They say, we want more money, which is a theme that's going to come up a lot more as East Germany collapses, and give us the chance to play abroad. And they're playing in this small league, usually of 12 teams, which Dynamo Berlin are winning pretty much every year. If they're not winning it, Dynamo Dresden are. It's very hard to test yourself in this situation. So the players themselves are beginning to kind of ask for greater freedoms to travel, to play abroad. So I do think kind of East German insularity, which you see in politics with Honecker's regime, also has a negative impact on football. This unwillingness to take risk, to kind of open up East German football to international exposure, whether it was the teams they were playing, whether it was the playing style, whether it was allowing players to go abroad to play. All of this, I think, does have a limiting impact on East German football. Yeah.
The takeaway for much of our discussion today is that in its 40 years of existence, give or take, of East German football, of East Germany itself, the political sports apparatus, it seems like, had a disdain for football and prioritized the Olympics
Mhm.
over football. And it's an interesting question to ask if, let's say, had they changed their priorities to their main focus on football, just how East Germany would have fared. I mean, who knows, but it's interesting to ponder, I guess.
Yeah, it's a fascinating counterfactual question, actually. If East German football had had the sort of the football specific resources and expertise
Yeah,
behind it.
imagine what
Yeah.
Brazil does for its national team.
Yeah, exactly. Now, of course, people like Manfred Ewald will say, what are you talking about, Shahan? We gave East German football tons of resources. They weren't very good anyway, and actually we indulged them too much. That was the argument of the kind of Olympic focused officials. Football already took up too much space. Frankly, we should be giving it less, not more. But I do think there's a counterfactual argument here to say that it might not have even necessarily been, I don't think it's so much about financial support, so to speak, and more about opening up East German football to the world. Like, football's a very different sport than, I don't know, a lot of the Olympic sports that East Germany did well in, like swimming or bobsledding or track and field. A, it's much more competitive. And B, I think you just have to constantly measure yourself, whether it's club or international teams, against the best. And I think for a bunch of reasons, East German football and footballers weren't really allowed to do this. So I go back to that phrase I mentioned of an East German FA official who talked to me, and someone else said this exact phrase. And I think an East German journalist said to me, they both said to me that East German football was stewing in its own juices. It was kind of stuck in this kind of pretty small world and it couldn't really get out of it very easily. So, yeah, given some of the talent available in East German football, in a more supportive political environment, possibly, with greater international exchange, more players
Yeah.
playing abroad.
How was that different, let's say, from other Eastern Bloc nations with comparable means, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a little bit different. I mean, there are some interesting comparisons there because let's take examples of Czechoslovakia and Poland, two countries, neighboring countries of East Germany, neither of them as successful in terms of the Olympics as East Germany, of course, but both had significant football successes in this period we've been talking about today. Czechoslovakians win the 1976 Euros, the famous Panenka penalty. And then, as we've been discussing, Poland
Yeah, and
performs.
the Czechs were particularly considered to be more technical. I
Yeah, more
imagine.
technical, more skilled. Like, I think that probably applies to the Yugoslavian teams of this period as well. Whereas I suppose these German team in that sense, maybe this is kind of a stereotype of German teams generally in this period. I think it's true of West Germany too, even though they were much more successful. They were generally seeing the German teams as physical, tough, maybe not the most technically adept, but very strong. And yeah, so maybe East Germany kind of got the worst of the West German reputation without the technique of the kind of other Soviet bloc teams. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think in Czechoslovakia and Poland, there wasn't this comparison with a rival nation. There was no Western Czechoslovakia or Western Poland to compare with their countries. So there was that to consider. I think probably in both countries, football was prioritized a bit more than in East Germany because East Germany had this successful Olympic program that it was its number one priority. Actually, the most interesting comparison here is with the Soviet Union itself. You know, the Soviet Union was East Germany's rival in the Olympic medal table, really. They were actually quite strong rivals by this point in the 1980s. And you could argue that the Soviet football, given again the talent available to it, the size of the country, underachieved on the international stage. Not to the same degree that East Germany did. They won the 1960 Euros, of course, got to the final again a couple of times, including, as we've been discussing, in 1988. But there was a sense, I think, in both countries that the authorities didn't really know how to handle football. It was hugely popular, but it was difficult to get football teams to the top of the international pyramid. And was it worth the risks of contamination from international contact that you might have to get in order for Soviet or East German teams to really succeed in the way that West Germany did, or Italy did, or France did briefly? And I think in the end, there was a lot of fear there that the authorities in East Germany worried about players defecting, which happened occasionally, as we've been discussing. They worried about humiliations against Western European opposition, which again did happen sometimes. So in many ways, it was a very closed and insular world, East German football. But at the same time, a lot of the fans and players understood international football. They knew it was important. And I'm not sure East German football ever resolved this tension between kind of needing to spread its wings and kind of having its wings clipped by the Stasi and the party and by this very small East German football league.
Incidentally,
Mm.
East Germany and West Germany were drawn together in the 1992 Euro
Yeah.
qualifiers.
Yeah. For the
So,
first time, right?
that's another, I guess, what if moment, if.
Yeah. Yeah, that is. So I mean, that is interesting and a kind of a
Uh,
slightly poignant sort of epilogue to the story, really, that East Germany, instead of finally getting to measure itself against West Germany in qualification for the 1992 Euros, eventually withdraws from that competition because East Germany from October 1990 ceases to exist. Germany is reunified, and East Germany by this point has played its last game, a 2-0 defeat to Belgium that is a pretty pathetic ending, I would say. I think there's only about 12 to 14,000
right.
people watching in Belgium. Most of East Germany's top players call in sick because they don't want to get injured in case they miss out on a transfer to a wealthy Bundesliga club. So it's a pretty sad ending, I think. And there is a bit of an afterlife here, as we've been talking about, because some of the top East German players do go on to play important roles in the national team in the 90s and early 2000s, but not many of them, it has to be said. The German national team remains a predominantly West German team, I think,
Right.
throughout this period, with odd exceptions like Matthias Sammer.
Not only politically, but in football terms, now East Germany was absorbed by the West,
Hmm.
and eventually the Oberliga and the Bundesliga. Again, the Bundesliga would absorb the Oberliga. I think, what was it, like 91, 92 season? I
Hmm.
think that's when you have the top two East German teams. I
Yeah.
think they joined the Bundesliga, and you had, for like one season, you had an expanded Bundesliga.
Yeah, I mean, I
So
think you
the
sum it up well. East German football, like the East German economy and East German politics, East German universities and school systems, it was all swallowed up by the West. I mean, some people, particularly in the East, would talk about the annexation of East German football and other parts of East German society. So the East German FA, the DFV, essentially was incorporated as a regional football association into the DFB, the German Football Association, previously based in West Germany. As you mentioned, in terms of kind of the merging of the leagues, it was basically the Bundesliga plus a couple of clubs from the East, the old East, and East German football clubs who played in European competition in the 1980s soon rapidly fell down the football pyramid in United Germany, ending up in the fourth and fifth tiers. Some of them went bankrupt because they lost all their best players. They didn't really have the business expertise to cope with a kind of capitalist football system. Chatting to people who were around in this period in East German football, there was a sense of the things they'd built up, particularly in terms of training and youth development, were kind of taken out of their hands and kind of overtaken by the authorities in the West. But that was kind of the political will at the moment, and in the early 90s, people wanted a quick unification. They wanted it on Western terms. That's why the Christian Democrats and Helmut Kohl was so popular. East Germany and the communists kind of put on the scrap heap of history quite quickly. And it was only a bit later on, I think, that some people, whether they were football supporters or kind of other people, began to maybe miss elements of the East German system. They even invented a term for it, Ostalgie, nostalgia for the old
Oh,
East. And,
yes,
and,
yes.
and I think some of that was related to not so much, oh, I really miss Dynamo Berlin winning all the Oberligas, but more the sense of an autonomous football space that was East Germany's and a kind of a retrospective pride in a moderate national football history.
Was the film Goodbye Lenin a reflection of this nostalgia, you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's exactly. I mean, it was one of the early examples, I would say, certainly for kind of international audiences of what we came to know as nostalgia for the East. And interestingly, of course, that film is kind of centered around a time just before unification in 1990, the summer of 1990. And of course, one of the scenes in the film, in the middle of the film, is it's kind of around Germany, United Germany, winning the World Cup in Italy, Italia 90. Obviously pretty much a de facto West German team actually in 1990. So really a West German team, but this victory being seen as kind of sort of preempting what was to come a few months later, which is the unification of the two halves of Germany divided during the Cold War for 40 plus years. So yeah, I think that film does and uses football interestingly in it to kind of point to both the hope for the future for United Germany, but also maybe what had been lost, whether it was East German pickles or maybe, though it's not discussed in the film directly, East German football.
In closing, what is the legacy of East German football in the history of Greater German football?
I think East German football is an under-discussed element of German football history. It's worth saying that kind of the top German women's team that emerges sort of dominates German and actually European football for a while in the 90s and early 2000s comes out of the East to Wiener Potsdam. East Germany had not actually promoted women's football very much, but it's interesting to note that the team from Potsdam becomes one of the dominant forces in European women's football before, as we're seeing today, some of the bigger clubs take over the women's game as they've taken over the men's game. But yeah, I think there's a tendency, because a lot of the history of German football is written by maybe historians focused on the old West Germany or on the Nazi period, on the early days of German football. The focus tends to be on the 1936 Olympics and Germany's performances or bad performances there. Famously, the 1954 World Cup final, the Miracle of Bern, maybe less so the 1974 World Cup final. But nonetheless, there's all these moments of German football history, and they're pretty much all focused on the old West Germany. So I think East Germany, perhaps to some degree rightly, as it doesn't figure predominantly in these conversations because it didn't have the same level of success. But as I've said it in many different times and places, the East German football team wasn't actually that bad. If you look at its performances per capita, it was pretty much in the middle rank of European football. There's even an argument that it did slightly better than you'd expect, given its kind of population size and other factors in the sort of wider reckoning. Yeah, so and of course it contributes to kind of the only match between East and West Germany in the two countries' history ends in an East German victory in this very powerful and symbolic moment in 1974. And throughout East German football history, as we've mentioned a few of the names today and in our previous podcast, it produced a fairly consistent conveyor belt of decent level European players. Maybe there was never an equivalent to a Beckenbauer, for example, or even a Karl-Heinz Rummenigge, but nonetheless, a lot of players, and you mentioned Streich and how he got international honours when he retired in the mid-80s, a lot of players who were widely and highly regarded internationally, but maybe just didn't have the opportunity to develop in the ways that their West German counterparts did. So yeah, I would say a bit of a neglected area of the history of German football. Of course, I'm biased because I've written a history of East German football. I would say that. And maybe not quite as bad as everybody thinks. The qualification campaigns we've been talking about today, I think there's a couple of real kind of grasping defeat from the jaws of victory moments, particularly maybe 1979 against the Dutch. But there's also a lot of hard luck stories and near misses. In elite sport, the margins between success and failure are often very thin. And East Germany, for various reasons, sometimes luck, sometimes structural reasons, whatever, often found itself on the wrong side of those margins.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our contact information and the links to your books are listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Alan, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Shan. Nice to talk to you again. And yeah, hopefully be back on again soon.
Thank you.